Conor will look at particular areas of the budget, but there's a lot in it. It's a 50-page document, so if the journalists have any questions about any area of our budgetary policy, they can obviously ask them after we've kind of given an overview. But the title of our budget is Another Ireland is Possible. And what we are trying to highlight in this budget is that Ireland has more than enough wealth and resources to solve the absolutely catastrophic housing crisis that this country faces, the cost of living crisis being faced by huge numbers of ordinary working people, to eliminate poverty and to properly fund our public services, to fix our broken health service, to properly resource education, public services in general, and to protect the vulnerable and the less well off in our society. But what's lacking is the political will on the part of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And that's really what we're seeking to highlight in this budget, is we have a housing crisis, a cost of living crisis, and public services that are failing ordinary people because Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are representing the interests of the super wealthy and big business and not using the resources that actually exist in our society to solve the problems that ordinary working people face. The big untold story of Ireland, while it's facing this catastrophic housing crisis, huge hardship for working people who are crucified with the cost of living crisis, and public services that are failing people, is that the profits of big corporations in this country have gone absolutely through the roof. So we highlight the fact that in the last 10 years, profits have gone up by 294%. An absolutely staggering increase in profits, and similarly the wealth of the very richest in Irish society has increased absolutely spectacularly, while ordinary working people are crushed with a housing crisis and a cost of living crisis. So our proposition, very simply, is if the corporations pay their fair share of tax, if we use the tax system to redistribute the wealth from the richest in our society, we can solve the housing crisis, we can address the cost of living hardships that ordinary working people are facing, and we can properly fund our public services and address the crises in health, in education, and eliminate poverty and protect the vulnerable, those with disabilities, the poorest in our society, and the least well off. And for us, the Apple tax case really is emblematic of the problem in Irish society, that the Irish government spent millions going to court in order to support a staggeringly wealthy company in its efforts to avoid paying the taxes that it owed to people in this country. And that's symptomatic of the wider misguided priorities of our government, which is always about protecting the interests of the wealthy and the big corporations, rather than representing and protecting the interests of ordinary working people. So, in the case of the Apple tax money, we are proposing in this budget that the Apple tax money would be used to more than double the output of social and affordable housing. The Housing Commission has confirmed that the government's Housing for All plan is utterly inadequate to address the catastrophic housing crisis that people in this country are facing. So we are proposing to use the Apple tax money to establish a state construction company, to use that money for seed capital for a state construction company, and then to double, or more than double, the delivery of social and affordable housing. So to increase from the current figure the government has is 10,000 social houses and 5,000 affordable. We are proposing to increase that to 25,000 social houses per year over the next 5 years, and to increase the delivery of affordable housing to 10,000 affordable houses each year for at least the next 5 years, and to use the Apple money to finance that and to develop a state construction company so we are not dependent on the private sector to deliver the housing we need in order to address the housing crisis. But beyond that, we also, and Paul and others will go into more detail, that we propose to introduce a wealth tax which could generate billions of euro in order to address the cost of living crisis faced by working people in this country, to introduce taxes on vacant property, on zone land that is being hoarded by property speculators in order to force that land into use to develop the social and affordable housing we need to address the housing crisis. We intend to use that money to make things like childcare freely available, to remove all charges and costs for childcare, for education, for the health service. And that can be done if we're willing to impose relatively modest taxes on the spectacular wealth of the very richest in Irish society. So that's the broad outline of what we're proposing, and I'll move over to Paul now to talk in a little bit more detail.
Thanks a lot, Richard. I think a conundrum that many people ask themselves is how we are a country that is a very wealthy country and yet so many people struggle. How so many people are raising their kids in hotels, in emergency accommodation at the moment, how there's almost 1 million people on hospital waiting lists, how there's over 100,000 children who are waiting for essential therapies, interventions, children with additional needs, and how the vast majority of people have seen in real terms their incomes be cut over the past number of years because of inflation, which has been driven by profiteering by the big corporations. And our budget, alternative budget, aims to answer that question of why that is taking place and to put forward a radical eco-socialist alternative about how things can and should and must be very, very different. And exactly as Richard has outlined, the fundamental reason is that for 100 years, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have run this state not in the interests of ordinary working people, not in the interests of those who are seeking to access housing, not in the interests of those who need assistance from our medical services, who need assistance in terms of education or anything else, but instead they have run this country in the interests of the major multinational corporations, typified by Apple, run the country in the interests of the big developers who are profiting from our housing crisis, and run the country in the interests of major corporate landlords who are making an absolute killing and who have an interest in the continuation of the housing crisis. This prioritisation, which lies at the heart of the capitalist system, the system of organising our economy for profit, not for people's needs, is reflected in the taxation system that we have, and in fact in the ideology of the establishment in relation to taxation, which treats the idea of talking about taxing wealth, taxing profits, as something that is absolutely beyond the pale. You can't possibly go there, and instead the burden of taxation to finance entirely inadequate public services is placed on ordinary workers, for example, through the USC, which at the time it was introduced was supposed to be an emergency measure in response to the financial crisis. So our priorities are very, very different, and that's reflected in our taxation measures, which I'll go through just a few highlights, and obviously if people want to ask more detail or about any of the others that I don't get to mention. The first one to mention, and again it speaks to Ireland being a very, very wealthy country, but a very, very unequal country, is our proposal for a multi-millionaires tax, a tax on the richest 1% in our society. So 99% of the Irish population would not be impacted by this wealth tax, only the richest 1%. So to introduce a tax on assets exceeding 4.7 million euros. This is in line with the Oxfam proposal, and which would generate 8 billion euros in revenue. Secondly, as part of moving away from the unsustainable tax haven model that we have in this country, moving towards increasing the rate of corporation tax on large corporations to an effective rate of 20%. And then on the other side of the equation, actually giving workers a substantial break by abolishing the USC for all incomes under 100,000 euros. Just to reference a couple of other particular things, one measure that would particularly benefit low-paid, low-income workers and families is to create a refundable tax credit. So at the moment you get a tax credit on the basis of the nature of your family and so on, but if you don't use all of that tax credit, if it isn't set against your income, you don't get the benefit from that tax credit. We would ensure that any tax credit that is outstanding, which i.e. is workers who are earning less than 18,000 euros a year, workers who are really finding it extremely hard, that would be a refundable tax credit, and not therefore the revenue would send those people a cheque and that they would get the benefit of that tax credit. Another similar measure, which again would benefit middle income and low income workers, is in line with the ESRI recommendation to change the situation in terms of the cliff edge of PRSI, where once you go over the point for PRSI, it's hitting all of your income, whereas instead now we're saying it would only hit over the threshold. That's a revenue neutral measure. I would point out they had a discussion on late debate last night, and numerous different critics were analysing the different opposition budgets, and they were all, while presumably they weren't all socialists, or perhaps none of them were socialists, they were all united in saying that the People Before Profit budget is the budget that would give the most to the so-called squeezed middle, which is ordinary working families who are really struggling to get by. The reason that is the case is that the impact of abolishing USC on incomes under 100,000 euros will be really, really dramatic. Far more dramatic than what we're going to get from the government, which is more just plasters on a gaping wound in terms of the cost of living crisis. They refuse to deal with the profiteering of the corporations, instead give people a few once-off credits that are nowhere near enough to deal with the fact that average families are facing increased bills compared to 2 or 3 years ago of about 4,000 or 5,000 euros, and then you get a few hundred euros in electricity credits. We need price controls, and we need to scrap the USC for income under 100,000 euros.
Great, thanks, Paul. So, Hazel, do we need to move these around? Yeah.
Yep, so I'm Councillor Hazel North, and I'm going to be talking about the proposals around the childcare within the budget. I have opened up a childcare myself in Ireland, and having a few kids myself, I'm kind of very immersed in the sector at the moment and what's happening in Ireland, and I think what we can all probably agree on is the fact that it's unaffordable and not accessible at the moment. It's clear that fees are one of the highest in the EU, so what we're calling for and what we're proposing within this budget is to move towards a fully public funded childcare system. We will be looking at moving and supporting the call from some unions as well that's supporting childcare workers to move towards a recognised scale within the childcare sector, similar to what would be seen within the primary care and secondary care. Shocking statistics that we have in Ireland as well is 98% of childcare workers are women, and the majority of them are on minimum wage at the moment. So not only are we looking at recognising the vital work that the childcare sector does in Ireland, but for me personally, one of the reasons that I really think that this is going to be so effective is that we're looking at getting at children early intervention, and that's what we have been recognising in society at the moment, whether it's around the level of poverty, particularly in disadvantaged or marginalised areas. And this is an option that we can do right through the whole childcare sector, not just at preschool, but looking at after school and looking at ways that we can support childcare and families within the summer months as well, extending that right through the year. We also are putting cover in for the extended maternity and paternity leave, which we have covered and launched a bill on before. So the overall price that's going to be proposed within the budget is going to be a funding model of 1.5 billion, and the breakdown is in there within our budget of how that's going to be broadened out. But I do think it's important, and I think again, our proposal is probably one of the most ambitious, but I think it's because we've been looking at trying to get in early into families, supporting them, and that's where we're going to be looking at kind of key models that we can do. So again, like the other speakers have said, if there's any questions within that model, I'm happy to take any. Thank you.
Gino?
Yeah.
Here,
Yep, sorry.
Oh, no, I can't. I was doing all the work.
Okay, thanks, Colin. So I'm going to be speaking about disability services and supports in this budget. So our proposal is to invest 2 billion extra in terms of DEM services, and I think one thing that has been raised many times is those that are on a disability allowance. We're proposing that anybody that's on a disability-related social welfare payment, that would be put up to €350. Also, we would abolish means tests for carers allowance, and carers would be paid at least €15 an hour. Because we've all heard pretty kind of damning stories of those that are, on a disability allowance that are kind of in perpetual poverty. And we've seen over COVID where the vast majority of people that had to kind of go on social welfare were actually on €350. So this is kind of a baseline in terms of where people should start at. So that's what we're calling for. And as others have said, we have a serious crisis in this country in terms of special education and special needs. And the country is awash with money. Yet those families that simply can't get elementary services, such as a school place, have been let down. So it's down to kind of bad planning and bad management, and this has to be rectified, and it has to be rectified by political choice and kind of will, because I believe there's a solution to every problem, and every problem, when it needs a solution, there has to be will in terms of services that are just lacking in terms of disability needs. Thanks.
Okay. And lastly, Conor, and then we can have any questions. Yeah. Right. Conor Reddy, I should say. Yeah, he was our candidate for Dublin North West.
Yeah, so I'm Conor. I'm a councillor in Ballymunfinglas, and for the last number of months I've been involved in the Equality in Education campaign in Dublin North West. So this journey, I think, began for me when a family friend knocked on my door and asked what we could do to help his son get a school place. So that was Greg Lewis, who you might be familiar with. He's been across the media for a number of months, applied for I think over 20 schools before he eventually did get a school place last week. So I guess over the course of the last year we've always been involved in disability campaign, and particularly campaigning for children's disability services. But over the last year we've taken a dive into, I guess, the world of campaigning around assessments and needs, around school places, and many other problems there are with children's disability services. I don't think it's an understatement to say that what we're witnessing at the moment is a national scandal. There are children who are being done irreparable harm by the denial of access to school places, to necessary therapies. Children that I know that are self-harming because they haven't been able to have appointments with psychologists. There's others who possibly will never be able to develop the ability to speak fully because they haven't got access to speech and language therapies. This is irreparable harm we're doing to children, and we've seen apology after apology for how children were treated in church-run schools in the 20th century. I think it won't be very long before we see a Taoiseach make an apology, state apology, for how these children have been treated, children with additional needs in education and in broader children's disability services. The problem obviously goes a lot deeper than school places. We know of 120 children across Ireland who don't have access to school places at all. But if you look at appropriate education, if you look at education that allows children to actually flourish and reach their potential, there's possibly thousands of children that don't have the SNA support, that don't have access to special classes or special schools. And that's in a country, as we've all said already, that's as wealthy as Ireland, one of the wealthiest countries in the OECD. So it doesn't have to be this way. I guess the crisis goes beyond access to school places. There's over 10,000 children, at least that we know of officially, who are waiting on assessment and needs. Assessment and needs are the most fundamental thing for children with disabilities. All other services flow from getting an assessment and needs delivered. And the state, for a number of years now, has been breaking its own statutory obligations to parents and to children with disabilities. There's a parent that I've been working with recently, Charlotte Cahill from Tala. Charlotte's been waiting for 6 years for a correct assessment for her daughter, Kyra. Kyra, as a result of this, hasn't been able to get access to school. She's about to start her 3rd year in preschool, and she's really suffering and beginning to regress because she hasn't got access to services. Now, I think the problem goes a lot deeper. If you look at just one CHO area, CHO 7 in Dublin South West and in North Kildare, there's 6,000 children waiting assessment and needs in that one area. So 6,000 in one CHO area. Between January and May of this year, only 22 assessment and needs were completed in that area. So we're failing totally. What would we do to address it? Well, for a start, on school places and appropriate supports within schools, we've costed hiring an additional 2,000 SNAs and 1,000 special education teachers. That comes out at €153 million. So a really minuscule amount when you compare it to the amount that we have in surplus and the amount that will be coming to us through the Apple tax revenues. In addition to that, we propose doubling the number of psychologists positioned within the National Educational Psychology Services, so they offer essential supports to children who are already in schools, and to ensure that they're getting kind of their needs met within schools once they're there. And then on top of that, there's the measures that Gino mentioned. Families are being forced into poverty here. We all know that parents, because they're not getting the state services, are having to go private for therapies, for assessments and much more besides. I met one parent from my own area who spent over €50,000 in the last 3 years on therapies and private assessments. That was a deposit that they'd saved for a house, and they're living in private rental at the minute, in insecurity, paying most of their income out on rent and on services for their children. I think you can only ever judge a society by how it treats the most vulnerable members, and on that, if we look at how we're treating children with additional needs and disabilities, we're failing as a state in this regard. So we want to change that. It is possible. Another Ireland's possible. We can look after every child and give them an environment where they can reach their fullest potential.
Great. So, listen, thanks to all our contributors. One other thing I think that hasn't been mentioned, just to say, there are many items in it, but I just think just a couple of other things that are worth highlighting. We're proposing to lift every single person in this country out of poverty. Currently, social welfare rates are considerably below the level of poverty, at risk of poverty level. So we are proposing that all social welfare payments and pension payments should rise to at least €300 a week. And the other important item, I think, to stress is, given that there is, when you look at the huge problems in our health service, in education, or even in having workers to actually build the houses that we need to address the housing crisis, labour and skill shortages are a massive problem in this country. And in that context, we think it is literally insane that we are putting financial barriers in the way of people getting qualified in the health professions, in the construction professions, in education itself. So we are proposing to abolish all fees for third level education, for postgrad education, and to significantly boost the resources available to apprentices in the trades, so that actually getting into the construction trades is an attractive option for young people, so to help us address the housing crisis. So I just want to mention those as well, because unless we actually find ways to train people up in these key professions, even if we do invest the resources necessary for health and housing and education, we won't actually be able to solve the problem. So we think all barriers to getting people trained and skilled and qualified in those areas have to be removed.
Richard and Paul, just two questions for both of you. So first of all, Richard, you mentioned at the start of the press conference that you want to create a state construction firm with the Apple tax. and that's potentially going to double the amount of affordable social homes available. So realistically, in fact, there could be legal wranglings over the money, over other countries perhaps looking for an element of it. When do you hope to have that construction firm in place in the best case scenario? And then for Paul, obviously in the lead up to this budget, there has been a lot of talk about giveaway budgets and giveaway proposals. So just what concerns do you have about a giveaway budget?
Okay, well, first of all, the Housing Commission report has indicated we have to more than double the housing output in this country. But we only have a very small number of private building firms that are actually capable of building on scale. So quite simply, if we are going to meet the housing targets that now pretty much everybody accepts have to be about 60,000 houses a year, the private sector, with the best will in the world, cannot deliver it. So the state has to intervene to address that. So for us, the state construction company is absolutely necessary. It's not a preference. It's an absolute necessity if we're to have any chance whatsoever of solving the housing crisis. So we would seek to establish that straight away to essentially merge what's left of NAMA and the Land Development Agency, but provide extra capital resources in order for them to actually recruit people in the construction trades and professions, so that we have a construction core that is able to build social and affordable housing on the public land bank. So we would commence that immediately. There's no, by the way, just on your point about, there's no indication that there's going to be any serious claim on the Apple money. I mean, I think that was frankly a red herring that was being deployed by the government in order to justify their shameful decision to back Apple in trying to avoid that €13 billion of tax. That money is available, and we would deploy that money immediately to provide the seed capital for a state construction company, to recruit thousands of construction trades and professions into a state construction company, and then provide multi-annual funding in order to double the output of social and affordable housing over the next 5 years.
Yeah, just in relation to that question of a giveaway budget. So I think...
Just 1 second.
Yeah. Sorry. I think it suits the government for there to be all this talk about the fact that they're going to introduce a quote-unquote giveaway budget, that ordinary people are going to get more of their own money back. That's a narrative that actually the government is quite happy to go along with. The reality is, if you look at what the government is talking about, at least according to what we know from the media, is the government is going to leave a situation stable whereby 1 in 3 families say that they have to skimp in terms of their own meals in order to make sure that their children are fed. An unprecedented number of families are reliant on food banks to survive. Huge numbers of people in a wealthy country are living in poverty, and we have shameful levels of public services in terms of healthcare, in terms of public transport, in terms of education. The government is not going to touch any of those things. And in reality, like, the norm and kind of the accepted space of where budgets are debated is like there's tinkering around small parts around the edges. But the fundamental, what is like broadly accepted by the political establishment, is that like every year we have massive giveaway budgets for the super wealthy in this country. We have huge levels of tax breaks. You have pitiful levels of tax being paid by the major corporations. You have tax breaks for landlords. You have a whole tax structure to enable those biggest landlords in the country to pay almost no tax. So every year we have giveaway budgets for super wealthy, and ordinary people continue to struggle. So our budget proposal is a very different sort of budget proposal. I wouldn't say it is a giveaway budget, but I would say it is a transformative budget. It's attempting to say that we have all this wealth in our society, and it makes sense to invest it to try and deal with the underlying social crises that we have, and moving away from the failed model of the market to deliver housing, to deliver childcare, to deliver all the basic services that are failing for people, and instead saying we need to invest. And that makes sense from a financial point of view in terms of the state investing in housing and so on, and it makes sense from the point of view of the vast majority of people.
It's also, by the way, just from a prudential point of view, worth adding that actually the government's approach is far more financially reckless, fiscally reckless approach, because the additional spending that they are proposing, which is totally inadequate to address the crises we're facing, is not being financed by actually gathering revenues in from this profitable multinational corporations, the vulture funds, or the very wealthy in our society, whereas we're actually marshalling new revenues from the profits of the big corporations and from the very wealthy in order to finance the dramatic increases in expenditure necessary to solve the housing crisis, to address the cost of living crisis, and to fund our public services properly.
I have a question for Paul, because Paul was the one that went through the details about the millionaire's tax. It's very striking that I think it's one of the very few figures that's in the document that doesn't have a PQ to back it up, because obviously you're basing it on the report from Oxfam. But just a couple of observations on it. First of all, if a lot of that wealth is in financial assets, then doesn't that wealth just end up being offshore and just transferred to another jurisdiction so that it goes out of the reach of your government, were you to be the government that was trying to levy it? There was a second point that I can't think of. The first one, I think, is the second one.
Sure. I mean, we had a very good discussion with Michael McCarthy from Oxfam at our Thinking a couple of weeks ago, and we went through this in some detail. And this is a shift. I mean, you as an avid reader of our budget documents would know that we've had a millionaire's tax in our budget statements probably for as long as we've had them. We previously did have a different model, which was slightly different than the Oxfam model, and we've moved to adopting the Oxfam model because we're persuaded by both their calculations and the kind of political rationale in terms of this is literally the top 1% of the population, whereas previously our millionaire's tax would have probably hit the top 4.5% of the richest 4.5% of the population. The point Michael would have made, which I think is correct, and that a left government would have to reckon with, is that these will have to be married to other measures. You know, a left government introducing a radical budget like this would have to deal with the possibility of capital flight. What needs to be introduced in response to that is the idea of capital controls, not to say that we just allow the wealthy to take all their money offshore. I mean, this is something that happened when Syriza came to power in Greece. The money kind of flooded out of the country, and Syriza effectively stood by and did nothing to stop that. That was a mistake. So we think a left government would need to do that. And the other measure is that, really a left government, and obviously the Irish government as it currently stands does the opposite on the world stage. The Irish government as it stands tries to cut across tax cooperation between countries. They pointed to, in terms of corporation tax, there needs to be a multilateral process, and they pointed to the OECD BEPS process. Now the Irish government is actively obstructing the idea of a UN process in terms of corporation tax. But similarly in terms of the question of wealth tax, there has been a process over the past 30 years, 40 years, of a decline in terms of levels of taxation, effective taxation in terms of corporate tax, also in terms of wealth tax, that is linked to these massive global flows of capital, the fact that they can go anywhere around the world and so on. A left government would argue for wealth taxes globally to try and stop that race to the bottom, and instead try and have a race to the top in terms of the revenue that we can collect from these people, but then also the public services that we can provide.
The other related question, and thanks for giving me a second to remember it again, was that you're excluding primary family homes from the wealth, and it's understandable to a point because it's the family home, but isn't the truth that an awful lot of the wealth of the wealthiest is tied up in the immense value of the property that they're sitting on? And do you still think that it's morally just to not tax a family home just because it's a particularly located home or particularly furnished home that is of higher value than others?
But just factually, that isn't the case. That a very large proportion of the wealth that exists and is held by the multimillionaires in this country is held in terms of their private family home. You know what I mean? If you think of a billionaire and they live in a very, very, very nice house, they have €1 billion in wealth, maybe 5 million of that is in their home. So like, I don't know what percentage of that is, but it's like 99% point something is in wealth other than their family home. So, you know, for your average person, it is true that basically all of their wealth, you know, their kind of notional wealth exists in terms of their family home minus the mortgage that they presumably owe on it. But actually, as you move up the wealth deciles and ultimately top 1%, quite a small percentage is in the family home. So the benefit, you lose very little in terms of tax revenue because you're still hitting the vast majority of the wealth of the 1%. And what you gain is clarity to people to say, we're against taxes on the family home. We don't consider that really to be a tax on wealth, and we're still for, and we included in this budget, an abolition of the local property tax, which is such a tax on the family home.
Is that okay?